Okay, right. The state of screenwriting in 2014 is very diffuse. It's losing the old boundaries between screenwriter-director, screenwriting, and television writing. This year, our speakers have reflected the multidisciplinary approach to filmmaking. So we have James Schamus, producer, executive of Focus Features for many years, and a renowned screenwriter. Emma Thompson, award-winning actor, screenwriter. Stephen Knight, award-winning writer and director. I think this year you're going to see 3 very different lectures, far more diverse than in the past. James Schamus is one of the world's great academics, as well as one of the world's finest screenwriters, as well as the ex-head of one of the 2 great independent studios.
These events are of a very particular genre, which is the chosen pseudo-celebrity, in my case, vaguely famous kind of person, stands on stage, shares their wit and wisdom, and somehow the audience is meant to be inspired and instructed, and a certain amount of advice is supposed to have been delivered by the end of the evening. This is a genre I can't imagine succeeding at, and so I'm pretty much going to do the opposite, which is giving a lecture on German aesthetics since the 18th century to now and how they relate to cinema today.
I assume that all of you, having lived for some time in Britain, great or lesser, depending on what happens, have attended a production, so even a school or community production of a play by William Shakespeare. You know, I don't know, I don't remember any. Much Ado About Nothing. And let's just say that the players were less than successful in their delivery of the play. I assume that when you walked out of the theater that night, and assuming that your child was not part of the production, so otherwise you would have a very different response, but that you just turned to your colleague, a friend, date, and said, "Oh, that Shakespeare just sucks. You know, I was so boring." No, you don't say that, do you? You say, "That was the worst production of Much Ado About Nothing I have ever seen in my life," right? So there's something strange about that, because let me ask this question. Some of you have gone to the movies this summer, not to the cinema like here, but to the movies. And I assume. And so when you walked out of the movies and it was, let's say, Pièce de Merde Part 3 from Studio de Crème de la Crap, whatever, starring 25 million plus 10% gross, and his 5 million against 3.5% gross love interest, and you walked out of the theater, and I assume you did not turn to your date and say, "You know, that film was terrible. The script was great, but the film was, what a terrible job they did with that script." Have you ever done that in your entire life? Once, even? So, well, you have. Probably it was somebody made a movie off of your screenplay. and so the crazy thing is the way, just that first distinction we make between plays and cinema. This is a distinction where film theory is born, really about 100 years ago, the first works of film theory. Hugo Munsterberg, who was a hugely popular public intellectual at the time, 1916, writes really one of the first great book about film and film theory. And these kind of comparisons say something. What do they say is the question. You have completed a screenplay. Okay? You've completed a screenplay. Have you completed a work of art? If you're an artist, it seems to me self-evident that your answer should be yes. But if we put that question in context, for example, you are a poet, and you have now taken your quill, dipped it in ink, and you have written a poem this morning before breakfast. The poem is finished. You've written a poem. When you finish writing a poem, you've written a poem. It exists. In some way, shape, form, manner, you have created a work of art. When you have created a screenplay, when you have finished a screenplay, you have created approximately 124 pages of begging for money and attention. That's pretty much what you've done. And how that gets you into the art category It's an interesting question. Or does it? I'm from the United States. I'm a proud member of a union that represents screenwriters. But we don't call ourselves a union. We call ourselves a guild because we're really fancy. And we're writers. We are the Writers Guild of America. So why did we end up calling ourselves a guild as opposed to a union? Right? Clearly, there's something going on there in terms of the trajectories and histories of the ideology of authorship, ownership, and creation. Right? And we have positioned ourselves as screenwriters in a hybrid space in which, on the one hand, we want to create intellectual property. And on the other hand, we want to get paid for it, and therefore we often give up ownership of it. Right? So we are creators but not owners, in a sense. So we're workers, but we are not bosses of our own art, which is a very strange thing.
And the ideology that creators and creative people rise above their fellow workers is an ideology I find tremendously suspect and, if not downright, I don't know what the word would be, wrong. We want both good working conditions and benefits and respect, but on the other hand, we want to pretend that we're not workers, that somehow we are something else. And that causes a lot of anxiety among my fellow screenwriters, I think.
The embeddedness of this bizarre relationship between creativity and the ongoing production of the concept of intellectual property is of the essence of the screenwriter's life. It actually conditions how we feel about ourselves, about how we feel about our work, and how we relate to the work and what the work actually is. And now we'll understand a little bit more why. Who's the guy who really created the screenplay form that we all use, that's in Final Draft, that's encoded in the very software that most of us writers use to write screenplays? It's a guy named Thomas Ince. I don't know if anybody remembers him now. He was one of the most important people in the history of cinema. He ran one of the biggest studios in the history of cinema, Inceville, and then he ended up forming a company with a lot of major players, including D.W. Griffith. And back in the old days, they used to have just production units that included a core of actors, and they would just go out for a day and say, you know what? They would say to Tom, we're going to make a movie, I don't know, like a gypsy is going to, you know, a gypsy family with the circus is going to take a baby, a white baby, and then there'll be a chase, and then they'll get the white baby back. He's like, that's a great idea. Go for it. And then they'd come back and they'd run the rushes, and he'd say, what are these elephants? How much does this cost? What's the budget? You know, it was all kind of amorphous. And what he said is, he said, look, I've come up with a great idea. It's called a screenplay, and this is I'm not going to approve any movies going out until I see the screenplay and I give it to a guy who we now call the assistant director, who's going to break it down, and then I'm going to send it to my accountants, and they're going to budget it, and then I'm going to give you this much money to do it. And so if you want elephants, you got to put it in the script, and maybe even in capitals so that they'll pay attention. And then I'll provide you a budget, and don't go over budget because it's going to come out of your, coming out of your salary, kind of thing. And he really rationalized what was essentially a chaotic serial production approach to filmmaking, and he did it through the medium, guess what, of the screenplay.
I started by working as an intern at a small production company. On my first day at work, I offered to read every script they had in development, as well as even the stuff that was being rewritten, so I'd read earlier drafts. And I stayed up all night and read, I think, 12, 14 scripts. And the next morning I wrote a proposal to rewrite one of them that seemed to be stalled. I had no experience, but since they had already invested all this money in a project that was stalled, they bizarrely said yes.
The screenplay was really the control function for the way in which time and money was organized in these production units. And to this day, we've adapted pretty much whole what Thomas Ince created as the ability for the money, the capital, to really organize and yay or nay, because they had a piece of paper rather than a bunch of people standing around a set waiting for them. It's a lot easier to say, you know what, it says 2 elephants, 1, rather than go on set and go, okay, now 2, now there's 1. So it turns out that the work that we do is work that both creates and inspires and catalyzes and motivates, but just as importantly, it is the grounds on which control and money and the executives and all those types, like me sometimes, intervene in the most effective way.
When you're actually writing a screenplay and say you come up with a draft, so to speak, and you're now rewriting your draft, what is a new draft? Is a new draft the amount of rewriting you did on it in one day, or 2 or 3 or 4? What a new draft is essentially that point in time when you are required to hand over your work to the producers and therefore call it a draft, and you hope get paid for that draft.
So the words on the page are really the matrix for the introduction of capital into the process. And that means that at that moment, something else happens. That those words do become not simply words and not simply inspired creations, but they become a place where we conflate 2 separate ideologies and 2 separate economic practices. One of those ideologies is the ideology of authorship. And we all assume, most of us, unless you're really trained lawyers or nerds like me, that authorship has something to do with another regime of how we organize the results and proceeds of that process, and that's copyright. Right? But if you look at the history of copyright, you'll notice something very strange. Copyright, from its inception, had nothing to do with authorship. And when you made a movie, let's say in 1904, you would shoot the movie and they would copyright every single frame separately. So now what happens? How about you're a company and you decide to make a really funny movie. And the movie is going to be called How a French Nobleman Found His Wife Through the Personal Ads. What happens if you're the producer of that film and 2 weeks later a movie appears called Personals? Well, that's what happened. So of course, company A, I think it was Lubin, sues. And they go, you can't. That was you can't, you ripped us off, right? And the defendants replied, no, we didn't. Not one frame of our movie was your copyrighted material. Not one. It's our movie. And at this point, it goes up to the appeals court, and the decision is made by the judge. He said, just a bunch of shots lined up one after the other don't actually make up a movie. It turns out that they're showing things, but a movie, it turns out, and this is actually the property that the makers of the movie own, is the telling. The telling, not even the story, but the telling. And that was the elegant solution. Suddenly, capital now can find a locus in an object that is completely abstract and yet recognized in law as the essence of its investment. That is to say, this narrator. We screenwriters like to think of ourselves as that person. But of course, that person is actually the embodiment of vast sums of capital, right, that congeals around this eventual text that our screenplays inspire. Right? So you find this idea of the ideology of the author transforming itself into a new kind of author, the kind of author that you see at the end of every film where it says, for the purposes of copyright, the author of this film is 20th Century Fox, right? It's not una filma di, James Cameron, right? It's the money is the author. Money is the author.
I think the ideology of attempting to lift oneself into the sphere of art and therefore demanding the respect that is due to an artist is a false road. I don't think we are artists, and it doesn't mean I think we're lesser people or contributors. We are workers, and I think workers demand respect.
Because I could go on like this, honestly, for like hours, as you can tell. But I do hope at least that little piece of the evening, or not so little piece of the evening, laid some track for the kind of conversation we can now have, which could be things like, where did you get your ideas from, or do you come up with plot points while taking a shower? The answer is yes. So, oh my God, and that's been me the whole time.
Okay. That was advice. Good. Amazing.